Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
In the winter of 1873, a small band of prospectors lost their way in the frozen wilderness of the Colorado Rockies. Months later, when the snow finally melted, only one of them emerged. His name was Alfred G. Packer, though he would soon become infamous throughout the country under a different name, the Man-Eater. After the butchered remains of his 5 traveling companions were discovered in a secluded valley by the Gunnison River, Packer vanished for 9 years, becoming the West's most wanted man. What followed was a saga of evasion and retribution as the trial of the century worked to extricate fact from myth, and Paul E. Pry, a once famous pioneering journalist, took on the cause of Packer. Man-Eater is the definitive story of a legendary crime, a gripping tale of unspeakable suffering, the desperate struggle for survival, and the fight to uncover the truth. The book that we're featuring this evening is Man-Eater, the life and legend of an American cannibal, with my special guest, journalist and author and Professor Harold Schechter. Welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. Harold Schechter.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Harold, for our audience, I just got to mention Harold Schechter is one of the most prolific and important true crime writers, period. I'm going to say in America today, just period. So I thought I'd just say that for all those stuff.
Thank you.
And we'll talk about at the end how many books you have written so far, and it is, again, prolific. Let's jump right into this story. As you introduce in the very beginning of the book, you set the stage for the very, very, thorny subject of cannibalism, a subject that everyone seems to be horrified yet fascinated by. So let's talk about John C. Fremont and the mid-1800s in the American West, and tell us who John Fremont is and what's the situation, what is the reality like in the American West in the mid-1800s?
Well, I mean, the West was at that time completely unexplored territory, very, very rugged, very, very primitive. There's a vast, vast unexplored wilderness. Fremont, who was known as the Great Pathfinder, was a person who was sent out to chart certain pathways through the West in the company of Kit Carson, the legendary scout and Indian fighter, and his Fremont's books about his adventures. Most people today remember Lewis and Clark, but in the 19th century, John C. Fremont was at least as famous as one of the great pioneering explorers who opened up the far reaches of the western wilderness to white settlement and colonization. And Fremont himself became such a celebrated figure that he was nominated as the Republican Party's first presidential candidate in 1856. And one of the charges that was brought against him, we think we're living through, a particularly nasty mudslinging presidential campaign right now. But back then, as I say in my book, the charges that were leveled by politicians against each other make modern-day mudslinging look like, the height of civility. And one of the charges that was brought against Fremont was that he was a cannibal, which, unlike some of the other charges, that he was illegitimate, that he was an adulterer, that he was a native-born Frenchman, back in the mid-19th century, as today people were, I guess they were kind of birthers around. But in any case, as it turns out, the cannibal charge was true because on one of his expeditions, Fremont and his men became trapped in these snow-choked mountains, and when some of them died and the others were starving, they resorted to cannibalism. So, I mean, part of the beginning of my book, what I do in the beginning of my book is put the Packer story in some kind of context, not only the context of, the incredibly harsh circumstances that these early frontiersmen and explorers faced in the American wilderness, but just in the context of attitudes towards what's called survival cannibalism, situations where men in extremely dire circumstances of extreme starvation have resorted to cannibalism as their only means of survival. And let me just interject. I've written, as you know, about some of America's most notorious cannibal killers, most notably Albert Fish, the infamous cannibal pedophile of the 1920s and 30s. The book Man-Eater doesn't deal with that kind of psychopathic serial murder cannibalism. It deals with a case of survival cannibalism and murder, but not serial murder.
Mm-hmm. Now, with this, you talk about, it's probably well known about the gold rush in California, but as you write in the book, within about 10 years, they said the rivers were panned out and disillusioned miners were searching elsewhere. So in 1958, you talk about William Green Russell. Where do they resort to, and where is the new El Dorado?
It was actually 1858, and it was in, there were these various mineral strikes, gold and silver, in the Colorado Rockies, and a particularly rich strike of ore in the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado, and that set off a second gold and silver rush that brought thousands of get-rich-quick hopefuls flocking to the mountains of Colorado. There was a famous, one of them was Pikes Peak, and you'd have thousands and thousands of these people in covered wagons with Pikes Peak or Bust written on the canvas canopies. So, Packer became caught up in that kind of hysteria.
Now, with this as well, with this mining craze, we're not talking about a place that's not fraught with its own problems in terms of accessibility and danger, and the elements in terms of the weather in the winter, and weather in all the seasons. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Colorado's, a gloriously beautiful place. I actually lived in Colorado for a year myself. But, the Rockies in the winter, and particularly back then, when it was largely uninhabited by, white settlers. So, excuse me, other than, there were some cities like Denver and so on. But in terms of the San Juan Mountains, very, very few outposts of civilization. And in the winter, the conditions were incredibly harsh. There might be 3 or 4 feet of snow in the grounds. There were these, precipices and gullies and chasms. I mean, it was, you really took your life in your hands trying to negotiate that landscape in the middle of winter. And that's what happened with Packer and his comrades. They set off very confidently in the belief that they could make their destination in a certain amount of time, and quickly found out that, they had seriously underestimated the harshness of the environment and the severity of the elements.
Let's talk a little bit about this Alfred Packer. Very interesting. You talk about not is his childhood, but you can get it back towards previous to, obviously, this fateful event where the men die and there's cannibalism.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about how James Packer from Salt Lake City comes to the Denver area, and under what circumstances and why.
Okay. Alfred Packer, not James Packer. Packer was born in Pennsylvania. He always claimed to be related to a very prominent Pennsylvanian named Asa Packer, who was a railroad magnate and the founder of Lehigh University. That was one of the many fabrications that Packer indulged in. The family subsequently moved to Indiana. Packer left home at a relatively young age in his mid-adolescence and enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War. Packer was afflicted, again from childhood, with grand mal epilepsy, and so he ended up getting a disability discharge. He was subject to very, very, very extreme and increasingly frequent seizures as a result of that illness. He re-enlisted in a different unit. He was discharged again, eventually drifted out west. He claimed, again apparently falsely, to have served with George Armstrong Custer. But in any case, many details of his past are shrouded in obscurity. But we do know that by the early 1870s, he had drifted around west. Again, he was doing some prospecting, making his living in various odd jobs. He eventually made his way to Utah, and that's really where the saga of Alfred Packer picks up.
Now tell us the situation. You talk about, right in the introduction of the book, that the circumstances to which people would resort to cannibalism, and throughout the book you cite examples of not only historic examples and less known examples of cannibalism in America, but also the prevailing attitude by society at that time towards it.
Yeah.
So,
society was. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No. Well, society was, first of all, of course, it's always been a subject of incredible fascination to people, who respond with a mixture, with kind of titillated horror. The most famous case in American history, is the Donner Party, which happened some years before the Packer case. And depending on, to some extent, depending on the character of the people who ended up having to resort to those extremities, the attitude could be fairly forgiving. In fact, one thing I discovered in my research is that cannibalism per se is not really illegal in virtually all states of the Union. So there are many instances, or significant number of instances in American history where people, again, who have been in these unimaginably nightmarish circumstances and driven half crazed by hunger and were near death by starvation themselves, and who resorted to surviving on the flesh of dead companions. That those people have often been regarded fairly sympathetically by the public. There's a famous case, I just made a movie about it, the whale ship Essex, which was one very, very famous case. They made there was a book, In the Heart of the Sea, and a movie recently released about it. Was one of the inspirations for the book Moby Dick. Where these sailors who were stuck on this lifeboat, ended up surviving by cannibalizing their dead comrades, and those people were not only not punished, but again, treated very sympathetically.
Now, you also introduced the situation, the circumstances in which Alfred Packer joins this group of people. Again, there is a mix of some of the storytelling he does about his background, and to that testament, he does a little bit of this trying to describe himself as a guide. So with this little tale about him being a guide, how does he impress these people enough so that they can take him on board? Because there was an amount of fee that was required to be joining this journey. So tell us how he circumvented that and how he came to be included. Well,
there was a group of about 20 miners who were all living around Bingham, Utah at the time. And, Packer got wind of the fact that they were organizing an expedition to the San Juan Mountains to prospect for silver. And Packer, who, as you said, had no money at the time, offered his services as a guide, claiming that he had spent a lot of time in the area. And he had, in fact, spent some of his time in Colorado, for sure, and that he would be able to lead them to their destination in a very short time. None of the other men among these other 20 miners had ever been to Colorado, so they were willing to, this one prospector whose name was McGrew, kind of took a shine to Packer, was willing to grub stake him, as he put it, that is, pay his way in return for, Packer helping him out with his horses and so on, but also, his services supposedly as a guide who could lead them to where they wanted to go in a matter of, a couple of weeks.
Now, with this, these people had seen people perish before because of starvation, so these people set out to calculate and then acquire enough supplies that they wouldn't starve.
Right.
Tell us how it was that with the supplies, but also was this a dangerous or not dangerous time to be going, and did anybody advise against leaving at that time?
Well, when they initially set out from Bingham, Utah, they left, I'm trying to remember exactly, I think they set out in November 18th, 21 men, including Packer, set out from Utah in November 1873. And again, Packer assured them that they could make the journey, certainly within a month, so that they would arrive there, again, before, according to him, the harshest part of the winter. In the event, they didn't get to the area for 3 months because it rapidly became clear that Packer had no idea how to get where they were going. But so the supplies that they equipped themselves with, were all based on this estimated time that Packer had given them, which was, severely underestimated. But yes, and then also they felt that they could probably, supplement their supplies by killing game along the way. But again, the weather was so much harsher than they had anticipated that they encountered very, very, very little game to kill.
Important part of this story, too, is the fascinating history that's included in this amazing story. and about, if I'm pronouncing it right, the Utes Indian.
Yeah. Utes, I believe. Yeah.
Utes, the Utes Indians of Colorado, and you also include the incredible history of the negotiation and how much land that they had owned and negotiated successfully for, but also their experience in living and surviving this often harsh area. So tell us a little bit about that story, about these unique Indians and their connection to this story.
Well, I mean, the Utes were this loose confederation of different tribes who were populating this really vast area of the Colorado Territory. And, of course, we all know the, very, very sorry history of white American expansion into that frontier. As soon as any valuable resource, gold, silver, whatever, was discovered on Ute territory, there would be this incredible incursion of white American settlers, and increasing conflict between the whites and the Native Americans, the Indians were constantly forced into this position, of having to negotiate these treaties, which would guarantee them supposedly in perpetuity, all this land. But as soon as somebody discovered more gold or silver on the Indian reservation, there would be another invasion of white settlers, and the Indians, this land that had been promised to them forever, they suddenly had to be renegotiated, and their reservations became smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. There was a very, very remarkable figure named Chief Ouray, who became sort of the designated chief of the Ute Nation, and who, was a figure that, the white America and some of his own people had somewhat different feelings about. Some of his own people, I guess, saw him kind of as what later came to be called an Uncle Tom, who was betraying them. To the whites, he was, he was called a friend to the whites. But, he was kind of a visionary person. I mean, he understood that, he was between the proverbial rock and a hard place. I mean, he understood that, without negotiating these treaties, his people were just going to be totally exterminated. So those were that was the native population that that Packer and his companions and all the white prospectors and settlers to the area, had to confront and deal with.
Now let's talk about how it gets down to its 5 companions and himself, including George Noon and Lutzenheiser and his friend McGrew, who really was pretty sympathetic, and sort of the attitude. What did they think about Alfred Packer after they realized he really wasn't much of a guide and they didn't have much to eat at all?
Well, I mean, some of the men, there's a guy named Lutzenheiser, as you mentioned, another guy named Nutter in particular. Some of the men had this antipathy toward Packer from the beginning. I don't think Packer had the most winning personality, and according to again some of the people he was traveling with, he seemed to be displaying kind of suspicious interest in the amount of money they were carrying with them, and they also felt that he was hogging much of their increasingly diminishing provisions. So there were a few of the men there who really bitterly disliked and distrusted Packer, even before it became clear that he had completely misled them into thinking that he could serve as a guide. The people he was traveling with, this guy Bob McGrew in particular, felt much more warmly towards Packer and felt sorry for him. The other thing, again, were these terrible seizures that Packer was subject to, which some of the men, were really, really, really put off by, unsettled by in a very, very deep way. I mean, they found it very, very disturbing. McGrew was much more sympathetic and would really tend to Packer when he was in the throes of one of these seizures. But Packer definitely, even again before it became clear that he really had no idea where he was going, had made enemies among those men.
So in fairly short order, certainly a lot sooner than they thought, they were already considering eating one of their horses. So we're talking about they went from a completely different state of mind and mode if they're considering their horses. So tell us about the first decisions to eat something other than, and you talk about eating things other than animals as well. So.
Well, as I said, Packer had promised he would get them to their destination in the San Juan Mountains, from Utah, in less than a month, and they had equipped themselves accordingly with provisions. It's a little unclear. I mean, even they probably. Were undersupplied even to that extent. Again, they were hoping to encounter much more game than they did. So, by the time they actually finally did reach the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, they had been reduced to eating the horse feed. I mean, they had eaten their horses' grain. They were really in a state of near starvation. They were, yes, as you said, on the brink of killing their own horses and eating their own horses, and then they were saved by a sudden encounter with Chief Ouray and a band of his Indians, who then very hospitably invited them into his camp. And the men set up their quarters there and engaged in some trade with the Indians. And Ouray invited them and advised them to remain with him at the Indian camp until springtime and the snow melted.
And what did they do with that advice after almost succumbing to starvation? What did they took that hospitality and they strengthened themselves. And what did they do with that advice?
Well, a number of them. First, this guy. Well, people called him Lot. His name was Lautzenheiser. Lot and four other prospectors. Really, after just about a week or so, began to get very, very antsy. And decided that they were going to set out and try to make it to this nearby Indian agency. And so they did that. I mean, Ouray strongly advised them not to do it. And in fact, communicated to them very emphatically that he thought that they would never make it there alive, but they ignored him. Greed, I guess, is a great motivating force in human behavior. These guys were very, very eager to make it to this mining spot and get started. So they set out into the wilderness. Packer actually tried to follow them. But Lot was one of these people who was so hostile to Packer that he actually drew a gun and threatened to kill Packer if Packer followed them. So Lot and these four other guys set out in the snow. And then a few days later, Packer and 5 other men followed in their wake.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So this is they set out from that youth camp in the second week of February, and so and as you mentioned, they've got the youngest and the oldest of prospectors. Real Swan is a man in his 60s. They have 16-year-old George California Noon. You've got a butcher named Frank Reddy Miller, and you've got a woman named Shannon Wilson Bell.
Not a woman. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Shannon Wilson Bell is not a woman.
Oh, pardon me. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, and also James Humphrey.
Yeah.
So tell us about their plight. What happens early on in this journey and what are the conditions? They know that there may be snow, but what are the real snow conditions in this?
Well, again, you have to imagine trying to traipse through a completely uncharted mountainous wilderness, basically in, like 2 or 3 feet of snow. I mean, snow coming up to your thighs, sometimes snow coming up to your waist, with really only the vaguest sense of all, of where you're going, and what direction you're heading, and again, equipped with enough provisions, to maybe last for a few days. They very, very rapidly, ran out of food. They were, frozen. They were starving. They were basically vulnerable, to the most, to the harshest kinds of, winter environmental conditions imaginable. So that was the position they found themselves in very, very rapidly. Of course, the way the story unfolded and the way I tell the story in my book is, Ouray and the other men who remained at Ouray's camp, saw Packer and these 5 other people you mentioned heading off into the wilderness on their way supposedly to this Indian agency, which was supposedly they were going to reach in less than a week. And then the next sighting of Packer, the next time anybody saw Packer, was later, 3 months later in April, when he emerged from the wilderness by himself and made his way to this Indian agency. And the other 5 men that he was with were not there, and in fact never seen alive again.
You also have a chilling part of your book when you talk about in late March or April that, again, a small party of UDs with some women among them said they came upon a white man camped by the Gunnison River, cooking his dinner, meat on a stick, and then apparently they went to see what he had thrown in on the riverbank or in the river, and tell us what it was that they found.
Yeah, this band of Ute Indians, as you say, came up this white guy roasting something on a fire, and when he saw them approach, he tossed it into the river and ran away. And they fished it out of the river, and it was a cooked human arm. So so that was the only reported sighting of Alfred Packer in the 3-month period from the time he and his 5 companions left Chief Ouray's camp, and when he showed up at the Indian Agency in April.
Now, it's interesting, it's fascinating, and again, truth's much stranger than fiction. You talk about the Indian Agency Los Pinos, and by the time he gets there, shortly after, it's amazing you write in a book, who is he met by? And then right away there is some initial suspicion, and there is a story demanded from Packer almost immediately after arriving there. Tell us about this altercation and incident.
Well, as you say, when Packer reached Los Pinos, and almost immediately afterwards, Preston Nutter, who is one of the guys who had been hostile to Packer from the very, very start, suddenly showed up. Nutter and three other men had very wisely taken Chief Ore's advice and remained at the Indian camp until the snow melted, and then set out. And just by happenstance, 2 weeks later, they arrived at the Los Pinos agency just hours after Packer showed up. And as I said, Nutter was one of these people who was always very, very suspicious of Packer from the beginning of his motives. Packer, and he wanted to know where these other five guys who had set off with Packer were. And Packer told him that he, Packer, had developed frostbite in his feet and had become snowblind, and was holding the other guys up. So they had left him behind and with a rifle, and they had set off into the wilderness, and he'd never seen them again. He had just somehow managed to survive by himself for all that time, and then made his way to Los Pinos, but he claimed that he had no idea where the other five guys were.
Right away, this Preston Nutter is suspicious and skeptical of the story itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you can tell us about what some people, for the other journey, were the unusual questions that he was asking about money, but also what Preston Nutter notices as a possession of Packer at this Indian agency. What does he notice?
Yeah. Oh, well, he noticed that Packer had in his possession a big skinning knife that had belonged to the German butcher, who was known as, Frank Reddy. They called him Reddy Miller. And, Packer had some story about that. He said that Packer had just stuck it into a tree and left it behind when the five other guys had gone off into the wilderness. So that seemed again a very, very dubious story to Nutter, that Miller would leave his knife behind. So.
Now, in terms of the story that he does say, and of course this story is an evolving story. He isn't immediately really suspected of much until some things happen. So tell us how the story proceeds in terms of any kind of holes to this story. Well,
after spending a little time at Los Pinos, Packer and the other men went to this nearby town named Saguache, where Packer holed up in a saloon and proceeded to live kind of high on the hog. I mean, spending a bunch of money gambling and drinking and treating themselves to various delicacies like canned oysters. This struck the other men as very, very suspicious because, they knew Packer had been so broke to begin with that, he'd had to basically barter his services in order to accompany the men. So they became very, very, very suspicious. of Packer's free spending ways, again, given how poor he had been before, and began to wonder where all this money had come from. And eventually, well, very quickly, Nutter in particular came to be convinced, since there was no sight of these other men, became convinced, Lot and his companions, who had set off before Packer and had also run into a lot of trouble, but they had finally made it to the Indian Agency. So the only ones missing and unaccounted for were Packer's 5 companions. And again, Packer suddenly seemed to be, inexplicably prosperous. So Nutter became convinced that Packer had murdered these other 5 guys and stolen their money.
And as a result, what does he do, and what does Packer do?
Well, Packer was really afraid that, he was in danger of being lynched. And just around that time, while they were in Saguache, the head of the Los Pinos Indian Agency, a guy named General Charles Adams, showed up, and Nutter conveyed his suspicions to Adams, and Packer at that time was still insisting, on his original story. But then finally, Packer's story changed.
Now, this questioning by Adams gets what initial admissions from Packer regarding the death of these 5 men?
Well, what came to be known as Packer's first confession was, it's important to keep in mind, because if you look up, if you Google Alfred Packer, you come across a lot of these websites that claim that he was the only American ever convicted of cannibalism in the history of the United States, which is not true. Packer never denied, well, except for his initial claim that these 5 guys had left him in the wilderness and that he'd never seen them again. But from the time of his earliest confessions, he never denied that he had engaged in cannibalism. What he did claim, however, is that he was completely innocent of murder. According to his first confession, after a short time, Israel Swan, who was as you pointed out, the oldest of this group of 6 people, died of exposure, and the other 5 men. Packer gave a very, very harrowing and probably pretty accurate description of the state of near starvation that they were in. They had been reduced to the point of boiling their own moccasins and eating them. They were trying to gather tree sap from the roots and eat that. They were eating whatever stray rosebuds. They were scrounging around the rivers for snails, which they actually couldn't find. So they were in an extremely, extremely, dire straits. And Packer said that Humphrey had died of exposure, and the other 5 men had eaten his flesh and then left the corpse where it lay and proceeded on. And then after a little while, a second man, I think Humphrey, had also collapsed and died of exposure. And then the remaining 4 men had dined on his flesh, and so on and so forth. And finally, Packer claimed that Shannon Wilson Bell killed, I forget which one, probably California Noon, and then Packer had gone ahead and eaten Noon's flesh. And then at the end, Packer and Bell made a pact that they neither would try to kill the other. But then, in fact, Bell tried to kill Packer, and Packer had killed Bell in self-defense. So that was his first confession. In other words, he freely admitted to cannibalism, denied that he had committed murder, admitted that he had killed Bell, but only in self-defense. And he also claimed, very importantly, that each one of the 4 guys that had been successively cannibalized, that their bodies had just been left in the places where they had died.
Yeah. Now, and you talk about in 1874, they find the 5 bodies. And so what is proven or disproven, or proven and disproven at that time with that discovery of those 5 bodies?
Well, eventually what happened was Packer, by the way, Packer was, put in jail. Packer said he would lead Lod and Nutter and this other group of guys, to the places where these bodies were, and to the place where he had killed Shannon Wilson Bell. And then he started out, and then he refused to do it, and they brought him back and locked them up in, what passed for jail. It was just really a little shack. And he actually escaped and remained at large for 9 years. Anyway, not too long after he escaped, there was an illustrator for a very, very popular publication at the time called Harper's Weekly, who was on assignment doing sketches of the Colorado mining area, and he came upon what had been a campfire with 5 horrendously decomposed and mutilated corpses, still all lying in their sleeping blankets and so on. It immediately became clear that these were the 5 men that Packer had stood out with. So an examination of the corpses showed that their skulls had all been crushed. They'd all been flesh had obviously been removed from their bodies. They could tell, by the knife marks on the bones and so on. Packer's story that these guys had died one after another, these natural deaths, and they'd eaten the bodies and left them where they lay, it was obviously a complete lie. All these guys had been, 4 of them anyway, had clearly been killed in their sleep. One of them, Shannon Bell, apparently his body was a little farther off. His skull had also been crushed. So it was very, very evident that these 5 men had been horribly murdered, at least 4 of them in their sleep, and then butchered for their flesh. And obviously the leading suspect in the case was the only person who had survived, Alfred Packer, and he immediately became the most wanted man in the West. He was known as the Man-Eater.
What were a couple of the other names for him that were just as interesting or more so?
I think they called him the human hyena. They called him a ghoul. You know how it is. I mean, whenever there's some horrific murderer at large, the press immediately comes up with very colorful, often, gothic supernatural horror nicknames for them. So, human hyena sticks in my memory, and I'm sure they called him a ghoul. I can't remember. Maybe you remember some of the others, but
those are the ones: the human hyena and the ghoul.
Yeah.
How is it that he comes to be captured? Who recognizes him, and what is he doing at that time while there's this huge manhunt in America for him? First of all, he assumed a pseudonym, Swartz. And he was roaming around the West. He was out in Wyoming.
He was supporting himself in various ways. He was, doing some, he continued to do some mining. Packer actually, he had been trained as a leather worker, and so he was, did some saddle making and so on and so forth. But 9 years after the events just related, in 1883, one of the former members of the original 21-man party that Packer had been part of, a guy named Frenchy Cabazon, who at that time was working as kind of a drummer, a traveling salesman, was stopping at a boarding house in Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, and he heard in the adjacent room somebody speaking in this weirdly high-pitched voice. That was one of the distinguishing characteristics of Packer. Apparently, it's a not uncommon symptom of severe grand mal epilepsy that some of the people afflicted with it have these very high-pitched voices. Cabazon recognized this guy who was calling himself Swartz as Packer, and he notified the authorities, and Packer was arrested and taken back to Colorado for trial. And of course, this was a great sensation, not only locally but really nationally. The capture 9 years after his escape of the notorious man-eater.
We don't have all the time that we'd love to go into this, but tell us about the highlights of the trial in terms of the people there that made the most damaging testimony and did show an incredible amount of animosity and personal investment in the trial and the outcome.
Again, Packer, when he was captured, changed his story once again. He claimed that, and it was something he more or less stuck to for the rest of his life. He claimed that again, all of them were on the brink of starvation. He had gone off one day to climb a mountain to do some surveillance, see if he could get some glimpse of the agency they were heading for, and that when he returned to the camp at dusk that day, he found Shannon Wilson Bell roasting some human flesh on a fire, and the other four men lying there dead. And then Bell jumped up and attacked him, and Packer killed Bell in self-defense. So that was his story. That was Bell who killed the other four men, and then tried to kill him. And he had shot and killed Bell in self-defense, and then he had made a little lean-to for himself and remained there for the next few months, living off the flesh of the dead bodies that that Bell had killed. At his trial, again there were there was this very, very, very devastating testimony against him by Lott and Nutter. There was so much prejudice against Packer by that point, that Packer received nothing like a fair trial. One of the interesting things to me about the Packer case is I came to believe, although it's still very much an open question that people continue to debate, that Packer probably was guilty of murdering these five guys. Although there are other people, again, who feel very strongly that he wasn't, but that's my best guess anyway. But nevertheless, whether he did or not, he definitely did not receive a fair trial, because he was being made to prove his innocence, which of course is not how American jurisprudence works. There was certainly a lot of reasonable doubt that his lawyer raised, but there was much prejudice against him. The testimony of people like Lott and Nutter, who claimed, and not only that Packer had killed these other people, but that he had deliberately led them into the depths of the wilderness in order to slay and rob them when they were at their most vulnerable. And Packer didn't do himself any favors. I mean, Packer was a very, very, very prickly personality at best. And he gave this long, elaborate testimony, in which he was barely able, to keep his own ugliest impulses in check. So
it is interesting to see how he thought he could control the courtroom, and for the great part of it he did. He made a statement that would be akin to a lawyer making an opening statement, and again, he was indignant throughout all of this, basically.
Yeah. He was indignant, that's true, and, possibly very justifiably indignant. I mean, no doubt justifiably indignant because, he realized the stack, all the cards were stacked against him. Although at some point, he seemed to feel in the beginning that he was, might get acquitted. He was actually even, possibly making plans to marry one of the local women since, his trial, like, the trial of most, notorious accused killers attracted a number of, I guess, what later came to be called groupies. But yes, he was indignant, at the charges that were made against him, and also very indignant that, that nobody in the courtroom could possibly really understand the kind of, horrendous circumstances that, that he and the others were suffering. But, subsequently, I mean, in the mid-20th century, and particularly after the Second World War, there were very, very famous studies done about the effects of starvation on human behavior. And it really, drives people crazy and reduces them to a state of really kind of primal savagery. And, it's just very, very, very hard to know ultimately whether, Packer's story as he told it was true or not. It just seems to me, it's always seemed to me very, very suspicious that it just seems to me that it was a little too convenient that Packer would go off for the day and come back and find that these other men, had been killed and were just lying there, neatly ready to, serve as 4 months' worth of food supply. And some other guy had done it, and then Packer had just killed this other guy in a way, that also seems not totally impossible, but a little implausible. So, So I came to the, my best guess, which I'm ready to admit might be totally wrong, is that Packer was in fact guilty of murdering these guys. But again, that said, he still did not receive anything remotely like a fair trial. So.
And in that you do talk about this interesting legal development where they fight for another trial, and then he's convicted of manslaughter, but due to the pressure, he's given this unprecedented sentence. And again, we don't have all the time to go into this, but I'm going to leave the readers and the listeners of this show to know that this is just, there's so much more to this story. And one of the things I just wanted to ask you about, and I guess, or you could comment about, was the incredible juxtaposition between the fascination, and he's selling souvenirs in prison, things that he's, little trinkets he's made, and people want to come and visit him. So there's sort of a juxtaposition between the bloodthirsty media and then society's fascination and almost admiration of the guy in a lot of ways, and then also that the media wasn't exactly in a concerted effort on board in terms of the persecution of this person, and that comes to the point where you get Paulie Pry sort of going the other way, making statements that a responsible journalist wouldn't make. So just tell us about that sort of whole incredible dynamic in America at that time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing you learn when you research these cases going back to the 1800s and even earlier, is that the public fascination, with sensational murders and cannibalism and so on and so forth. We sometimes think that that's just a product of modern society, and I mean, obviously, right now we're living at this moment when there's all this media obsession with true crime, but the only difference between now and then is technological. I mean, now you have like podcasts like Serial covering true crime, that they didn't have that back then, but the public appetite to read about these kinds of horrendous crimes, and to maybe even, get some kind of memento of the crime, there's nothing at all new about that. I mean, that's always existed. Yeah. There was always some difference of opinion among journalists about whether Packer was guilty or innocent and how fair a trial he received. As you said, he was originally sentenced to death. He was going to be hanged, and then his lawyer managed to get that conviction overturned on a legal technicality, and he was retried. He couldn't be retried for murder. That would be double jeopardy. So he was tried and convicted of 5 counts of manslaughter and given 5 consecutive 8-year sentences for a total of 40 years, which was essentially a life term. He was in his 30s by then, maybe even a little older. But then this very crusading Denver journalist named Polly Pry, who was doing an expose on prison conditions in Colorado, encountered Packer and, of course, knew how notorious he was and interviewed him. And she became convinced that the story that he told was the truth. And, that Bell had killed these other guys, that he had killed Bell in self-defense, that he had cannibalized the corpses. But, again, there were other cases, notorious cases of that kind of survival cannibalism, where the people had not been prosecuted anyway. So she set about, she launched this crusade to get Packer pardoned. And ultimately he was paroled and then lived out his last few remaining years, kind of as sort of something of a little local celebrity. By then, the West and the frontier, is already, turning into a kind of mythic thing. And Packer seemed like one surviving, relic of this, past. And, when these brave frontiersmen, would venture into the wilderness and deal with these horrible conditions and so on and so forth. So, and he died still insisting on his innocence and then, entered into the realm of American legend.
Absolutely. And I wanted to say, too, for those people that they're going to discover this book, that you also talk about basically, and again, there's not one shred of anything that happens in this book that isn't without controversy, that there's an exhumation made. And and so that will be for the people to discover themselves that there is, again, this case fascinated people right from the very beginning, and in various ways the media picked up on it, and he went from reviled to hero to reviled to hero to myth to the butt of jokes and curiosity. But again, like you say, he has gone on to be an infamous legend in American history. So.
Yep. He's part of American folklore.
Absolutely. I want to thank you very much for coming on and talking about Man-Eater, the life and legend of an American cannibal. And for those, Harold, again, how many true crime books do you have under your belt now? What's this number, if you can remember?
I'm going to say a dozen, but yes, I'm going to say a dozen.
And for those that are going to look up your record in terms of your work, you've written about some of the, if not almost all of the important cases in America in depth and fascinating, again, definitive accounts of some of the most heinous villains in America. So I want to thank you very much, Harold, for coming on once again, and joining us to talk about Man-Eater. I want to thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Do you have a website?
Do
you do Facebook?
I don't do Facebook, but there is a haroldschechter.com website. I think I do have a Facebook page, which I never go on, but that somebody else maintains for me, so people can contact me that way.
Yes. Well, again, thank you very much, Harold. Good to talk to you. Thank you very much, and you have a great evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good night.
very much, Dan. Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye-bye.